Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. And today it's my pleasure to have with us here as our guest in the studios of the Greater Northshire Access Television Studios in Sunderland, Mr. Derek Boothby, a distinguished resident of Manchester. Derek, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. I've long wanted to have you as a guest on our show, and this is really wonderful to have you here today. For those of you who don't know Derek, he has quite an illustrious career. He was a former UN Arms Control Officer and was the Deputy Director of Operations in Iraq following the first Gulf War in the early 90s. Today he's retired but retains his deep interest in international political and security affairs and is also very active in local civic organizations as well. So Derek, your timing is very auspicious here, because today, this week in the Journal, of course, as you know, we published an op-ed piece that you very nicely wrote for us on the subject of the, I guess now infamous video titled "Innocence of the Muslims" that a few weeks ago provoked a wave of violence and demonstrations around several large cities in the Middle East. And as we all know, in Libya and Benghazi, 4 American diplomats were slain as a result of that. It also has a continuing ripple effect that is still being felt. So I wondered, just to kind of get us started, if you could talk a little bit about what your reaction was to the video, whether or not you think the American administration's reaction has been appropriate, and what does this tell us kind of about the state of things in the Middle East today?
Yeah, certainly. Firstly, I don't suppose many viewers have actually watched the video, and I went out of my way with YouTube to actually look at it, all 15 or 16 minutes. It's actually a trailer for a longer movie which has not yet been finalized or produced. And the video is truly offensive. As I said in my article, The Roots of Muslim Fury. It shows Muhammad with his family living in the desert. It shows him as being power hungry and vicious. It shows him as being a pervert. It shows him actually having sex with his wife and other women. So you can imagine how this is deeply offensive. In fact, if it was, as I said also in the article, if it had been called Innocence of the Christians and it had been Jesus instead of Muhammad, I would imagine that a large number of ordinary church-going people here in USA would have been deeply offended.
But do you think that that would have led to some of the violence and demonstrations that we then saw following that?
There's the difference. In fact, it's the violence that in fact erupted, and the widespread violence. And I'm sure that in fact quite a number of those in the streets probably haven't even seen the video either, but they were stirred up to it by militant voices. It was first taken in Egypt, and then Arabic was dubbed over it, which is what created the fuss. But in fact, there are other factors at play here, lying behind the violence, and that's really was the substance of my my op-ed article. That we need to have a broader and a deeper understanding of why was the violence and the reaction so violent and so vicious as it was, setting aside the attack on the US consulate in Benghazi, which I think appears to have been much more of a deliberate, targeted attack, and the Al-Qaeda subsection taking advantage of the video to do it. It's the violence elsewhere.
Well, in your op-ed piece, you explore sort of the roots of the Muslim fury and go back to the Middle Ages, and using a book here by Bernard Lewis, a well-known historian, on what went wrong and how the Islamic world and the Western world managed to kind of divide so far. What do you think accounts for that? I mean, my take on it is that at some point around 1500, the Islamic world went into, I guess you could call a state of relative decline compared to the West, which was rising economically and militarily. Is that anger, or maybe it's a sense of humiliation, kind of what fuels some of this resentment on the part of some of the folks we saw in some of the television clips that documented the demonstrations that followed the video?
Yes, I think it's all of the above. Professor Bernard Lewis, when he wrote this, this book, What Went Wrong, the clash between Islam and modernity in the Middle East. And he sets out here, arising from 3 lectures he gave in Vienna in the late 1990s, and he sets out the fact that round about the year 10, 11, 1200, 1300, Islam, the Middle East, in fact was the center for culture and civilization, art, science, math. After all, these days the numbers we use are Arabic numerals, right? And so it was the center. And they, at the time, Europe was very much fighting with each other. There was nothing in Europe that was of interest to the seers and the leaders of the Middle East. And so, in fact, what then happened was that in the Black Death, in 1348, 1356, that area, killed off about 1/3 of the population of Europe. And thereafter there was a massive social and economic upheaval. And it didn't lead directly, of course, to the Renaissance, but it meant that a whole new things were possible which hadn't been possible before. And so Europe had a Renaissance, and then that was followed somewhat time later by the Reformation. And all this created new avenues of thought. And Europe, in fact, began to develop to be entrepreneurs, it developed trade, and to look abroad, and the inventions that came out of that, and the creations that came out of that, and the Industrial Revolution, all that left the Middle East behind. Now, the Middle East at the same time was involved in a projected battle between Persia and the Ottoman Empire. And by the time we get to the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to atrophy, and then we finish up with the First World War. And after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain and France, arising from what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and Georges Picot of France, they sliced and diced that area that had previously been the Ottoman Empire onto French influence and British influence. If you look at the map today, you'll see straight lines between Jordan and Syria and Saudi Arabia.
No geographic boundaries, no rivers, no mountains, or anything like that.
Absolutely, and those are just drawn on a map by this Brit and this Frenchman. And the British were given 3 Ottoman provinces, which they bundled together and called Iraq, and then they placed King Faisal on the throne. Now, all that meant that at the time that the Middle East and the Islamic peoples were being left behind by modern inventions, also there began to be a lot of modern influence and modern interference. And then, of course, sail changed to steam, and steam propulsion, instead of being coal-fired, was oil-fired. And lo and behold, Westerners found all this oil in Baku in Azerbaijan and down in the Middle East, and so more interference took place. Perfectly normal, competitive commercial development as far as the West sees it, but interference quite often as far as some of the local Arabs see it. And then, of course, British and French influence was replaced by American power, and then you finish up with 2 wars in Iraq, you finish up in a war in Afghanistan, you finish up with the Israel-Palestine situation, and eventually you end up with a lot of resentment, a lot of humiliation, which can easily be stirred up. You know.
Well, so what do you see as the way out of all of that? I mean, as I've tried to follow events in the Middle East, I've been struck by all these references to the absence of a moderate strand of thinking in the so-called Arab street, or the band of popular opinion. There seems to be one group of Islamic fundamentalists who are fairly extreme from our perspective. And then we have a set of military-backed despots who are either our allies or at least people we've been able to work with. And then somewhere in between, I assume there's this great swath of people who are kind of pretty much like people anywhere, who just want to kind of live an ordinary life and have a better life to look forward to for their children. But this group seems to be fairly silent, at least until relatively recently when a group of what sounds like moderate Libyans did indeed, overrun one of the headquarters of the militias in Benghazi that ostensibly was responsible for the attack on the consulate there. And that's really the first time that I can recall ever hearing about kind of the quote-unquote ordinary citizens really actually stepping up and saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not what we're about.
Yes, well, I mean, it's always the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. It's the squeaky wheel that attracts the attention that needs the oil. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the bicycle is functioning perfectly well and quite silently, which is a metaphor for what you're talking about. I think one's also got to bear in mind that certainly in the last 30, 40, 50 years, the birth rate in those countries in the Middle East has been very high. The economic development has been very low, and therefore there's a lot also of unemployment. Now you take a lot of young men who feel a part of their religion is to have a responsibility for their family. That's part of the Islamic way of life. And in fact there's unemployment, and therefore they don't know whether life is worth living, and what is life worth living for. So firstly, they're discontented. They're unemployed, they're dissatisfied, they resent, there's a lot of resentment which has got to come out somewhere, whether it's a resentment against foreigners or whether it's a resentment against their own autocratic leaders, and so they can be easily stirred up. So in fact what we've actually seen is when militant voices choose to stir them up after Friday prayers, then you get this coming to the streets. Now, as far as the Arab Spring was concerned, which started in Tunisia, if you remember,
right.
When there was, again, a young man who was trying to sell fresh fruit from his barrow, and along came the police yet again and turned it all over, right. and destroyed his wares. He had nothing to live for, so he set himself on fire. And from Tunisia, it spread, if you remember, to Egypt, then to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Libya, and indeed we're seeing things in Syria, right? Yeah. So fundamentally, how does one handle this? And I think it's extremely difficult for us in the West.
I mean, how does the U.S. handle it
diplomatically? I think it's extremely difficult in the U.S., whether a president is Democrat or Republican, to handle this. Because on the one hand, part of our Western principles is democracy. Let the people speak.
Let them see videos that may be offensive.
That's right, and that's freedom of speech and such. And so if the people, the mass, the Arabs in the street, steps forward and overthrows the government, governments which quite often Western governments have been happy to work with, even provide weapons. I mean, the United States has, and still continues to provide, over $1 billion worth a year towards the Egyptian military. Much of that money, of course, is spent here in USA buying U.S. weapons. So it's not just giving the money away, it creates
jobs. Does recycle back.
Recycle. But the fact still remains that the governments are forced to walk on eggshells. Because having had this long and productive and worthwhile stable period with President Mubarak, and the maintaining the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, then all of a sudden to have Mubarak overthrown, what should a Westerner do? On the other hand, should a Western leader, be it President of the United States or the leadership in Europe, should they in fact be just allow an ally like President Mubarak to be thrown under the bus? You remember that phrase? Alternatively, should they side themselves with the people from the street? But then again, who in fact is going to come from the street? Right. Muslim Brotherhood or whatever.
Jeffersonian Democrats, or are they going to be something else?
So it really isn't easy. So fundamentally, I think my personal view is that the way the United States has tried to do this balancing act with Egypt, with President Morsi, who just spoke at the United Nations for the first time in late September. They're probably struggling with the difficulty of how to go forward, not knowing what the future holds. I think it is not easy. The Arab Spring has yet to unfold, and it's going to take quite some time before it settles down.
Well, one of the other topics of great interest, not only this week as we're sitting here taping this show, several major figures, as you mentioned, from the Middle East are speaking at the UN. We're going to have the Prime Minister of Israel and the Prime Minister of Iran spoke yesterday, along with President Obama. But we're also watching very closely the whole situation that's unfolding in Iran, with the potential that they are developing a nuclear weapon that the Israelis find particularly disturbing. That's also bumped into our presidential campaign here as well. So just to kind of shift gears then and talk about how the whole contours of things in the Middle East are unfolding, what is your feeling about what we should do with the Iranians? Do you think that the Obama policy of trying other measures other than direct bombardment of these facilities by aircraft or missiles is the right way to go, or should we be maybe looking at what the Israelis seem to prefer that we do, which is to embrace the idea of a military strike?
Well, my personal view, and I realize that this is perhaps not held by everybody, is that probably one of the issues that keeps a U.S. president awake at night is whether Israel will take it into its own hands to take unilateral action against Iran. Because if it so did, because of the security arrangements and the support that the United States gives to Israel, the United States would inevitably be pulled in. Added to which, Iran has threatened that it would close the Straits of Hormuz.
Oil prices would skyrocket.
The Straits of Hormuz, let's remind ourselves, the Straits of Hormuz are about 30 miles wide at their narrowest point. Something like a quarter to a fifth of the world's oil passes through those straits, and there are in fact two shipping lanes. One going north, 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile sort of no man's land but neutral area for safety, and another 2 miles wide coming south. So that means that these shipping lanes are something more or less halfway. That's 9 miles. Now, from the Iranian coast, the reaction time for a missiles fired from the Iranian coast to fly over 9 miles is so short that in fact a lot of shipping companies basically simply wouldn't want to put their tankers through. And the insurance rates were probably triple or quadruple. The United States has already said that if that happened, it would take action to clear the Straits of Hormuz, but that would take time. So in fact what would happen, I would imagine, would be that the oil price would probably go up to $300 a barrel.
From its current level of around 80 to 100.
And it's around about 96, I think, as we speak today. Now, that's one aspect. That's Iran's reaction. But the other aspect, of course, is the military difficulty that Israel would have conducting an attack. If you remember, in 1981, Israel sent a bevy of about 8 aircraft to bomb the Iraqi reactor, the Osirak, which is fairly easy for them to do. And more recently, they bombed the Syrian, right?
Yeah.
Now, the direct line from, let's say, Jerusalem to Tehran is almost 1,000 miles. That's a direct line. And if you actually put a ruler on a map, you'll find it passes almost overhead over Baghdad. Any aircraft that fly from Israel to Iran, it's no longer just a question of they're bound to be detected. Added to which, Israel has about 300 F-16s, which are the fighter bombers. Now, an F-16 probably has a range of about 750 miles. That is to say, 750 a radius. If you put a bomb load on the F-16, its radius probably is reduced. It would need to be aerial refueled. To be aerial refueling, Israel has, I think I'm right in saying, about 7 or 8 KC-707s, which are the Boeing 707 aerial refueling tanker. If you load an aircraft up with bombing, to get up to a height, first refueling probably takes place over the Mediterranean. Then it has to be aerial refueled again sometime over its journey. Then it has to actually arrive at target, and it has to be refueled again on its way back. So you're going to have a lot of aircraft in the air. And then there's a question of the sites. Now, Osirak was on the surface. If you look at a map of the sites of the Iranian nuclear sites, which the National Threat Initiative has issued, they're all over the place. There's Natanz, south of Baghdad, Qum, also south of Baghdad, Arak, which is further to the west, where they're building a heavy water reactor. And then there are uranium enrichment sites, and several of these sites, in fact, are deep underground.
Well, given the difficulty of conducting a successful military strike, given what you just said, and the fact that the odds of them getting overflight rights across Iraq are probably
they wouldn't bother about overflight rights; they just fly. You know?
I mean, do you think the Israelis are bluffing? I mean, this just seems like such an incredibly impossible adventure that this is just saber rattling.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. He has the responsibility for the security of his people. He has made it clear that he does not think that Israel can afford to have Iran with a nuclear weapon. I would suspect that his military advisors are sort of saying, look, this is going to be very difficult. And I didn't even touch on the fact that in order to get down underneath, down to the bunkers, the weapon that an Israeli F-16 normally carries might be a GBU-10. That weighs 2,000 pounds. That will scarcely scratch the surface of something that is 300 feet underground. The United States has got a massive ordnance
bunker buster,
30,000 pounds. That's 15 tons. Wow. Right? There is no aircraft that the Israeli has that could carry it, even if the United States was to allow them to have them. And I don't think the United States wants that to happen. So fundamentally, one would suspect that Prime Minister Netanyahu feels a political pressure from the security of his people to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon and gets stopped before that position. Militarily, they're probably saying, Prime Minister, we will do whatever we are told to do, but please understand the difficulties. And you have to, there's one other imponderable, and that is the fact that every time so far, Israel has always been successful. If Israel was not successful on this occasion, it would burst that bubble. And that bubble of invincibility is very necessary to protect. So that's another risk that Netanyahu would have to take. So the bottom line about all this is that he might feel that he sooner or later has to take action. In the meantime, as far as the United States is concerned and the Western countries, they prefer to let this happen by by sanctions, although President Obama has made it clear that eventually, if Iran was to actually put all the units together into a nuclear weapon, then that would be a line beyond which
That's the red line.
That's the red line.
Famous red line we've been hearing so much about. But clearly,
but I personally don't think that Iran is actually going to do that.
Right. Well, I would think that they would probably get more leverage out of being one screwdriver turned away from it, and
That's
being in the position of saying, you know, if you guys really antagonize us enough, then we will go forward. But you know,
that's right.
Hold the threat over everyone else's head rather than go forward and then actually be you know, a full-blown rogue state.
Yeah, that's called the breakout position. In other words, one thinks that, I mean, Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Organization, but although they have always had arguments with the International Atomic Energy Agency over their readiness to allow full inspections. But Iran has often said that they don't intend to have a nuclear weapon. And the Grand Ayatollah, who of course is the person who really controls things, not President Ahmadinejad. President Ahmadinejad is the voice box, but the person who really
and a lame duck one at that. At this
that's
point.
right. But the person who really controls is the Council of Guardians, which is all the Ayatollahs led by the Grand Ayatollah. And they're not stupid, these people. So fundamentally, I think they probably want to get themselves in a situation whereby they've done all the research, they have the ability, but they will not actually put the whole thing together. Because I think they've always also recognized that countries that actually have nuclear weapons or nuclear capability get listened to a lot more than countries that don't.
Witness North Korea.
That's right.
Which would be completely ignored by everybody if they didn't have a nuclear weapon, or for that matter, even Pakistan.
Yeah.
One could argue that what makes Pakistan a strategic player of way beyond what its importance would be otherwise is the fact that they have about 100 nuclear weapons somewhere under safe.
Whatever they have. We hope they're safe.
We hope they're
That's right.
safe.
That's right.
Well, Derek, we haven't touched on many things we could have talked about. The situation in Syria being one, the evolving situation in Egypt, kind of what's going on, and just sort of the whole general strategic situation in the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestine situation is another one that comes to mind. But in the minute or two we do have left, I did want to also make note of the fact that you and I will be partnering on a class at the Green Mountain Academy of Lifelong Learning, starting in October. On today's headlines or hot topics, and you'll be taking 4 sessions in October, and I'll be finishing up 4 in November, and I'll be laboring under the handicap of following in your footsteps here. After you've set the standard high, I'll now have to be kind of, you know, at least sort of adequate.
Yes, but you'll be doing it in November, so you'll have to deal with the election.
Yeah, I'll get the election, right? And then the aftermath, the grim aftermath, or whatever it may turn out to be. But what an amazing time it will be to have such a class, and the 20 or so folks that have signed up for it. I hope it'll turn out to be pretty interesting, because there certainly is no shortage of things to talk about.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, again, there are lots of international things, there are lots of national issues in USA, immigration as well as the election, and of course there are some local things as well, which people might be interested in. And my view is that one asks the group, what does the group think are in the headlines? What does the group want to talk about? I look forward to it.
Oh yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. And like you say, there's also the local things going on right here in our neighborhood as well as statewide, and never any shortage of controversial issues there to be parsed over.
Even the roundabout.
Even the roundabout. I found myself thinking the other day, what are we going to talk about after the roundabout is built? I mean, my God. It certainly is a fascinating thing to watch. Well, Derek, thank you very much for making the time to come down here and talk about all this with us, and hopefully all of you will have a chance to read Derek's op-ed in the journal, and you know, it's quite thought-provoking, and I think a lot of people will find themselves thinking twice about this whole situation. Anyway, thank you for watching. This has been The Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, Managing Editor of the Manchester Journal. Been our pleasure to have you with us here on the Greater North Shore Access Television, and we'll see you the next time. Have a great day.